Hello, Grant. It's nice to see you.
Nice to see you too, Michael.
Um, it would for those of you that don't know who you are, would you be able to give a brief introduction of who you are and what you do?
Yeah, I'm Grant Gates. I work at Johnny and Friends, which is an international disability ministry. I work in our international ministries department as an operations analyst. So I go through a lot of data. Sometimes I get to see things about Singapore or Fiji or East Asia in general that warm my heart. I also am pursuing a PhD in Hebrew Bible at Claremont School of Theology, and I am specializing in Hebrew Bible and disability studies. So that's close to my heart academically as well. I serve in various capacities at church, but I have served a lot in disability ministries at church. And long before that, 15 years before that, Michael Seusen was my small group leader in high school. So we've gone way back and we've stayed in touch since then.
Mm. Well, thank you for taking the time for this. The specific topic that we have for this conversation is how to start serving in a special needs ministry. And one of the things that I appreciate about you, Grant, is that um, although you are not pursuing a PhD just because you have too much free time on your hands. You desire to dig deeply into things, but you don't let that prevent you from serving practically. And special needs ministry is a very practical ministry. It's essential, but I think just to start off, do you think it's safe to say that most people are either intimidated or would even say they're scared of the idea of serving in special needs ministry?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, I was there at one point as well about 10 years ago when I first started hearing about special needs ministry at our church. It just sounded like something that you needed to be a specialist for. Special's usually in the word. Perhaps we should take special out of the name at some point. That might help. But it sounds like a specialist thing, so that can be intimidating. It's not,
Hmm.
though. It's really not.
What are what are what are some of the reasons why people would not want to serve in special needs ministry?
Yeah, I mean, not to get too psychotherapeutic right off the bat, but I think it forces you to deal with questions about who you are when you realize that intellectual disability could happen to anyone. And so you get faced with sort of these existential questions of sort of, what if this was me? Right away when you start serving in
Mm.
disability ministry. And I think maybe not everybody vocalizes it that way, the way I just did. But I think a lot of that actually sort of issues of projection is a lot of what tends to make us uncomfortable in those situations. And then there's just sort of the general things of you basically know what a relationship with someone like you is supposed to look like. You have an idea for social cues, and you realize all that's out the window as soon as you get into special needs ministry. So that can be intimidating, and I affirm that that is intimidating and difficult to get past.
Mm. So I think a lot of people, they don't want to make mistakes. They want to do things well. And when they get out of their comfort zone, they wonder, what do I do if there's an emergency? Or some people, if they want to aim to be biblical in their reasons, they might say, well, I don't have this particular spiritual gift or giftedness. Um, how just briefly, how do you respond to someone that might suggest some of these reservations?
Yeah, I mean, practically, I have frequently called into question particular spiritual gifts in the first place. I think we tend to over particularize how Paul talks about spiritual gifts when I'm not sure that's what Paul was really intending to do in the first place. I think he was trying to paint with a broad brush to give you the idea of what spiritual gifts look like practically in the church, not trying to categorize people into boxes. And
Mm,
so when you come to terms with that, and you're like, okay, maybe, there are plenty of people who special needs ministry might not be their gifting for their primary ministry, but it's not like their gifting's really that far off from being able to be helpful in special needs.
mm. So, would you say a lot of it is more of a heart to serve than particular spiritual gifting or calling, as some people might say it?
I would absolutely agree with that. And I think if we were coming towards qualifications for special needs ministry, I would put first and foremost a heart to want to be there.
Mm,
Occasionally, some of uh, there's no quite polite way to put this. Some of the worst volunteers I've seen in special needs ministry were actually people who are specialists in special needs, but they didn't want to also be doing it at church. And that's
mm,
fine.
mm,
Sometimes you do need kind of like a church work separation for your life. I get that. But if you just do it because you think you're going to be good at it, or you think you have to do it and you don't really want to be there, that will have downstream effects that are bad on your service.
mm. What are the requirements or criteria that you think should be in place for those serving?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, it does start, as we were just saying, with heart for people with disabilities. You have to want to be there. You have to want to serve. Uh, you have to be flexible. And I think your church needs to seriously work through what the background check, legal requirements, those kinds of things are going to be for special needs. And you need to be spiritually healthy overall yourself. You can't
Mm,
be going to special needs because you think you're retreating from your spiritual problems and you're going to fix them there. So if you're spiritually healthy, you want to be there and you want to serve, you pass legal background requirements, which churches have to do local research to figure out how they should do that. Um, and you're flexible to see what the Lord will do through you, then I think you've hit the main requirements.
mm. Is there anything that you think volunteers should know or be aware of before they jump in?
I think the biggest thing volunteers tend to forget when they first get into special needs ministry is that there's a whole ecosystem supporting each person with special needs. That includes
Mm,
parents, caretakers, day programs, school teachers, doctors, physical therapists, occupational therapists, speech therapists. And you're just one small part of that ecosystem. And you serve that individual best the more aware you are of how you fit into that ecosystem. So you might
mm,
be there essentially just to be their friend or their buddy, and that's fine. But there are going to be aspects of that ecosystem that are going to help you do that job better. If you know that they're using a speech therapist and you know what the speech therapist is working on, you're going to be able to communicate with them better. If you know they're in a certain day program, that's going to help you understand interests of theirs and have better conversations with them. If you know kind of their teachers or parents or what programs they're doing, that can be really helpful with behavior issues because then you can keep the same program in place to address those behavior issues.
mm. That's excellent. Um, how do you think a local church can specifically best prepare these volunteers? Do you think it should be um, a introductory meetings where they have formalized training? Do you think there should be mentorship programs involved? What recommendations do you have?
Yeah, and I think all of those are great. There are online courses, for example, that Johnny and Friends has on that too. There are plenty of general training things that I think are helpful for volunteers. But I think the most practical single recommendation I would give is that the church should be trying to document as much data as possible from that ecosystem I was alluding to. They should have an idea who this kid is, who this person is, what's going on in their life, and have those kinds of behavioral issues documented, physical issues documented, obviously really basic things like nut allergies documented, and that's going to serve the volunteers well to have access to that file.
Hmm. Should a local church try to integrate people with special needs into the other ministries and areas of the church? Or what are your thoughts on it being integrated versus a separate ministry?
Yeah, I have a natural bias towards integration, and I think there are good reasons for that. I think theologically, the idea of each person being in the church because God put them there includes people with disability and includes the gifting given to those disability. So you want them integrated as much as possible. Now, culturally, there can be very good reasons that you don't have them all integrated. And so then it's a wisdom issue that you walk out yourself. And that's
Hmm.
not, I don't mean culturally in the sense of like, oh, in African culture, we view everyone with disability as cursed by God, so they can't be in the congregation. I mean, for example, in the United States, people with disability were generally institutionalized until the 1970s. So we have a cohort of people who were born before that who grew up under institutionalization and still tend to live in kind of pseudo-institutionalized homes today. So an integrated approach won't work for them because that's not how they live the rest of their lives. Now with the younger Americans who don't grow up under institutionalization, integration works a lot better for them because that fits the rest of their lives better. So if you're kind of aware of what disability approaches in your government, country, culture are in general, that can kind of help you inform how you would make that decision.
That's helpful. How can you best equip if a church chooses to pursue equipping buddies to serve in the special needs ministry? How can you best equip these buddies to serve well?
Yeah, and then that's going to depend on who you're integrating and stuff like that, right? I would kind of go back to my answer for preparing the volunteers. Having as much of a documented file system so that they know who they're serving is great. The other thing too is as much as possible, if you're doing buddies, consistency is good. If you have John with autism comes every week and you pair him with Paul every week, that's going to be really good and really ideal for integration. If you have to rotate, like it's Paul one week, and then it's Joseph the next week, and then it's Sloan the next week, and then it goes back to Paul, then the documentation becomes even more important because there can be all these changes that every individual buddy doesn't get to know about.
Practically speaking, have you seen a pattern that works well to find a balance of giving buddies a break if necessary and having that consistency maintained?
I can't think of one that comes to mind immediately of a great sort of pattern to it. I do kind of have a recollection that one of my proto special needs ministry experiences was the very informal service I was thrust into as a kid, holding a hymnal for an elderly woman with some level of disability. She used a cane and couldn't really use her hymnal. And then that became something I basically did every week. So pointing back to that pattern, if something's more organic like that and informal where it can be, that runs against the documentation thing I was just saying, I know, but the informal ones might stick and be more consistent if there are situations where you can pull that off.
How would you approach in youth ministries or children's Sunday school? How would you introduce that idea of informal relationships or buddies so that it would grow naturally?
I mean, the simple answer is you tell the good kids who like to know that they're good kids what they're supposed to do, and you make them do it. I'm not even kidding. The kids who like to be well behaved and generally like to be compliant with authority are going to respond well to being given responsibility. So,
yeah, I think what I've seen in the past is that some people can have this sense of, if I commit to this, I'm agreeing to a relationship that could potentially threaten my other relationships. So every Sunday, instead of spending time with my friends, I have a commitment where I don't get to invest and enjoy these other relationships. How would you come alongside some of them, and some of those thoughts and processes could start at a young age, but I think particularly with junior high and high school, and do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking more on the younger kind of Sunday school 4th through 6th grade levels, and I think that's less of a concern there. I think though, this depends on your particular context, but if you could get like a small group involved, you're gonna kind of collectively be the buddy for so and so every week, that's gonna go a long way. So rather than putting it then on one kid to say you're gonna stand with John every week, if it's kind of here's John's small group collectively is gonna sit together and make sure John's fine that week. That's gonna work well too, and that can take off well at younger ages too, and that that could be dependent on what format you have your youth ministry in, but I think you can adapt it to different formats.
So what should a local church do if they don't have anyone that has experience in this area?
This might be controversial, but I'll have to explain what I mean by this. Don't start a disability ministry if you have absolutely no experience and no expertise. But I'm drawing a line between a programmatic disability ministry and just being a church that's welcoming and opening to disability in general. You need to start with making sure you have a church that's building up kind of a heart open to disability in general first. You've got to start there. And then you do need to identify leaders and get them trained so that they have some expertise and experience before you start the formal program. So every church should be definitely in the open to disability, generally would minister to people with disabilities camp. But a formal program without someone committed to it, without expertise in it, is just destined to fail anyway and will probably be bad. So work towards that rather than trying to force it earlier.
That's very helpful. You've basically answered my next question, which was, where should you start if you don't have a qualified special needs ministry leader? What are some of the practical ways that you would take those that do have an interest and a desire to be equipped to potentially be ministry leaders? How would you recommend they begin that process of learning?
Yeah, and there are a few good options here. One would be if there are other churches in your area, just kind of doing an informal apprenticeship kind of thing with another church that's doing a similar ministry to what you want to do. That's a really easy way, and it's really natural and organic. I would preferably start there. Another option, and I don't mean to plug Joni and Friends too much, but they do have a lot of online coursework that would help equip a future disability ministry leader, and it's excellent. The only reason I put it at number 2 is because online is a step down from hands-on. So I'd rather you go get the hands-on experience. And I'm sure Joni and Friends would rather have you have hands-on experience as well. And then a third option to consider is you could actually just dive into something a little unorthodox, like do some extra special education teacher training, do some disability studies certificate or something at a university. But that can get you the kind of experience that you're looking for anyway. So even if it's a little unorthodox, it can still be very practical and still be effective.
So are there times when it might be appropriate to turn people away if their medical needs are too great?
Wait, the volunteers or the individuals?
the individuals. So if you're starting a ministry and those that are serving, if they have the biggest hearts, but if someone shows up and they are still convinced that they need to share the gospel and minister to this person, I think sometimes in scripture we can have convictions that are appropriate and right, and we could say, well, I don't want to turn anybody away because everyone needs to know Jesus Christ as their Lord and Savior. Is there ever a context where you might say, you know what, we're not equipped at this time?
Yeah, and I mean, there's give and take. There's a lot of push pull here. You do have to be honest, but you have to be careful with sort of the greater good of those overall that you're serving. For example, if there are extreme behavioral issues on someone's part and they're completely disruptive wherever they are and you can't figure it out, I'm not necessarily saying you don't serve them at all. I do think in most of these cases, you can be creative to find another way to come around the family and continue to help with that individual. But it's not going to be in your main disability ministry program at that point. That's going to be broken off into something else. And you do have to be honest at some point when you need to move them into some sort of kind of special attention group. Behavioral issues would be the main one that I think of here. It could come across sometimes, I suppose, with severe medical issues as well. But I think you're going to be less inclined to push them out in the first place for that reason. So I'm less concerned with that one. I think you're going to be able to find creative solutions more easily if there's a simple physical barrier as opposed to a behavioral barrier.
And what are some practical steps that a church or the church leaders could take in helping a church understand how to relate to those with severe intellectual disabilities as a whole?
Yeah, I mean, this word gets overused sometimes, but you want to find a way to appropriately platform people with intellectual disabilities. This doesn't mean that you're like having them preach the sermon, having them lead worship. I think that gets taken places that are unhelpful sometimes, but you need to expose the whole congregation to them somehow. So you could have some people with severe intellectual disabilities pass out bulletins or work as ushers. That could work for your congregation. If you play videos in an evening service sometime, you could get testimonies of some sort of video from them. Just any sort of creative exposure that is fairly natural and integrated to everyone else that gives a good platform to these people. It's going to help people learn to relate to them over time.
So what are some of the expectations that you might have for volunteers? Going back to some of the earlier questions, some of the people that are nervous about it might be thinking, well, I don't know how to help with a medical situation, or I don't know if I could physically restrain someone that is having a behavioral issue. Do they need to have a certain level of fitness or strength, or what should be expected from someone that wants to serve in this ministry?
Yeah, this is where teams are good, because you might have a team where you have an expectation that someone on the team is strong enough to pick up a child or restrain someone when necessary. Again, there can be all sorts of legal complications with this, so do your research in your cities and countries before jumping into this. I would go kind of back though to my original, is spiritual health is really important. Heart to serve people with disabilities specifically is really important. Commitment's really important. Flexibility is really important. And I can't understate that passing a background check is really important for this kind of ministry as well. Once you start there, disability ministry, you get to customize so much to individual people that any specific expectations are going to be more dictated by the specific individuals you're serving than they're going to be kind of general principles.
And then as we get ready to wrap up, do you have any advice for a church that is just starting out with special needs ministry?
Yeah, I mean, I know this is cliche, but it's kind of the variant of Excel still more. It's wherever you are in the path, just keep the momentum moving and don't give up. You could be really early in the path. You could still be needing to sell your senior pastor and elder board on this. You could be further down the path. You could be trying to push people through a year of training so that they know what they need to, how to structure the ministry. But wherever you are, just keep moving. As you get more experience and more momentum, these things really do take on a life of their own and grow. God does tend to bless this ministry very greatly.
Are there any warnings of pitfalls that you would give?
Yeah, absolutely. It would be very, very careful with who you have volunteer. When I'm alluding to spiritual health and background checks and heart to serve, those are major pitfalls of once you get that program running and it has a life of its own, you feel like you have to get bodies in the door to serve, but you love the people that you're serving. So you need to ensure that only the best people that God has called to serve that ministry are there actively serving.
I've heard someone once say that special needs ministry can turn into the leftover ministry. And what I'm hearing you say is you need to essentially do the opposite of that. You need to take,
yes,
at minimum, the standard you would apply to any other ministry, or potentially raise that bar.
Yeah, give the leftovers, I don't know, to college ministry or something. I don't know.
Well,
this is not the ministry for leftovers. That can cause major problems, including legal problems down the road if we're not careful.
Well, this is very helpful. Thank you so much for taking the time to work through this. We appreciate you.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me, Michael.
Bye.